So then when it came to Abel's pregnancy, they told me that since I was of advanced maternal age, I should do this test called Natera. And what really sold me was that they told me that we could find out if he was going to be a boy or girl.
Yeah, I've heard of that before.
Really early. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm like, okay, like sign me up. That sounds great. Well, we did that test and it ended up coming back inconclusive. So, which really isn't, that can happen sometimes for a number of reasons. And so then there was some kind of issue with like where it was really hard with like insurance, like going round and round with them, and they billed my insurance like $8,000. So I had a pretty
For the test?
Yes, and it was only supposed to be like 200 something out of pocket. And so then I was just like really
$8,000 for one test?
Yeah. So then I was really I had such a bad taste in my mouth because I had to like go through all these hoops to like resolve it with my insurance. So I was like, I'm just not messing with this test anymore. Like they asked me if I wanted to redo it and I said no. And so then there was another test around like 20 something weeks, and that was a blood draw. And I remember I had that done. And what that test does, if I remember correctly, so it tests my blood. But then when you're pregnant, and again, I'm not a doctor, so I'm just kind of repeating what I was told. But when you're pregnant, some of the baby's DNA or whatever is going to be in your blood. So they can do this draw and then figure out, I guess, I don't know what all they test for, but Down syndrome is one thing that they can flag on the test. Because if I don't have Down syndrome, but then his DNA is in my blood, showing that he does, then clearly, I guess he probably, I guess they think there's a good enough reason to believe he does. But there are other things that can cause that test to come back like abnormal, like something with like your placenta. I don't even know. So anyway, I had that blood draw done, and then that blood draw came back as abnormal. And so then I remember
that trigger like more tests than
yes. And I remember when they called me, well, I actually called them because before they would always just kind of call and say like, oh, everything's fine. And I was like, okay. Well, then I knew I was waiting on a phone call from them and it never came. And so I thought they should call me by now on that test. So I called the nurse's office, which I had done before a few times. And they were like, well, the doctor's going to have to call you back. And I thought, okay, that's kind of weird. And so then one of the doctors called me and I can't even remember. I remember I was pulled over in like the Target parking lot, and he told me that basically the test came back and it was abnormal and there was a risk for Down syndrome, which I didn't really, I mean, I obviously knew what Down syndrome was, but I didn't like actually know anybody personally that I was close to like with it. So I didn't really know that much about it other than like my surface, knowledge, which was very limited. And so then he's like, we recommend some other tests, blah, blah, blah. We recommend that you go see this genetic counselor. And so it was just a lot because I went from kind of like, expecting like, I guess nobody really expects anything to come back. And then when it does, it's like kind of, throws you for a loop. So I think I was more scared because I somehow knew that people with Down syndrome can be higher risk for heart conditions. And that really scared me. And so then I was thinking like, oh gosh, because like I don't think the cognitive delays I don't know if I ever even like thought about that or worried about that. It was all just more like, could he have like some, life-threatening condition as a secondary result of this? Yeah. So that really stressed me out. So then
is that just because is there some sort of connection with the genetic abnormality, I guess, of it that then leads to those risks, I guess?
There has to be because it's a very high percentage. I mean, I've read it can be, I know at least 50% of people with Down syndrome have this very common health condition. But with I can't remember exactly what the heart condition is, but it's one of the more simple heart conditions to correct. I do know that.
Oh, okay.
But kind of lost my lighting there.
Light switched off.
Yeah, my lights are going a little bit crazy. Yeah, give me a second here. I'll fix it. So anyway, it has to be something like that, I guess, because it's far too common for it not to be. So then that kind of led us down the path of now we have to go see a genetic counselor, and that's where, the additional tests and such would be ordered. And that was an experience, the genetic counselor. Yeah. But and that's how we would end up having get referrals to all the additional testing, which one of those additional tests they wanted me to do was they wanted me to redo the Natera test, the blood draw, and the one that was $8,000. So I did it again. And when we did that test again, it did come back with a very high probability for Down syndrome.
Now, is that what the test? Oh, there's a fly flying. Is that what the test gives? Is a probability? Like, is it literally like this percentage?
It is like a probability. I think there's a lot of confusion about what the results, like how to actually read them. And I used to know so much more about it, but it is a very convoluted kind of equation, I guess you could say. But basically, after all was said and done, the likelihood that Abel will be born with Down syndrome, they told us was like 40%. And so
that's way lower than I thought you were going to say.
Yeah, and that was like a whole bunch of different things they took into consideration, because also like he didn't have a lot of the classic markers. So for example, like a lot of times the babies like won't have a very present nose bridge. He had that. I'm trying to think what else. He didn't have the extra fluid behind his neck. No, he did not have a heart condition. He doesn't have a heart condition. So there were a lot of, like, if I hadn't had this Natera test and these additional tests, which you can obviously decline any of these tests I had. Any test I had that ended up giving a high probability for Down syndrome was completely elective. So they would not have found this on any of the scans, because typically Down syndrome is diagnosed around 20 weeks because of the scans anyways, just because they'll find the heart condition or something else. And so without this, we would have had absolutely no idea. It would have been detected on any other kind of scan. So I get a lot of questions from people asking me if they think that they should do the tests or if they should not do the test. And it's so hard because I feel like for me, it was better because I was able to prepare myself. But if it's going to stress someone out or, or if it's not going to change the outcome, which we didn't definitively know, because when we went to go see the genetic counselor, which I was not a huge fan of any of that interaction that took place.
So when you say the genetic counselor, is that someone that looks at all of the results and then kind of explains to you like what you're looking at?
Yes. And it was just a very negative experience. And I could see how somebody who didn't have the support that I did could be really like badly affected by the approach that this woman had. It was just very awkward. And, she just kind of like, well, first of all, she pulled out a binder with photos of people with Down syndrome. So it was really strange because it was like, well, I mean, yeah, I know what people with Down syndrome look like. Like, they're not like, the Yeti. Like, I don't, you know what I mean? Like, I need to, I don't really need, it was just, and then she kind of like went through all the issues, and she kind of even like suggested that he would have a heart condition, even though by that point, because this was pretty late. I mean, this was like, I was 28 weeks along at this point. It was pretty
28 weeks, is that what you said?
28 weeks. Yeah.
Okay.
So it was pretty like definitive that he wasn't going to have a heart condition, because we had already had, a couple different appointments with cardiology and had determined that. So, but she kind of still brought it up as if it was still, going to happen. And then despite us, because for us, like, we never considered terminating the pregnancy. It was just never like in our head. We never thought to do that. So she still brought it up multiple times.
Wow.
Like to the point where like
that far along at 28 weeks?
Yeah. Well, I mean, you're very limited to where you can go. Like, I think she said we'd have to like at that time go to like maybe Chicago would have been the closest place or something. But it was like, well, we didn't ask. And like then even after I said, well, we're not interested in that, it's not something that we like had even like thought about doing. And she still brought it up like 2 more times. To the point where Chris reached out and like squeezed my knee under the table because he knows me too well, and he could tell I was about to be like, ma'am, stop. And so, but it was funny because, and this is the honest to God truth. So I didn't mention any of this, but so in between Ella and Abel, we got pregnant with another baby. And we ended up losing that baby. It was about 12 weeks. And at the time, like, we just didn't know after that loss, like, am I going to be able to have any other kids? Because I did have to end up like, I guess, I did have to end up like terminating that pregnancy. It was an ectopic pregnancy. It was causing me to bleed to death. So
that's where it like attaches like inside the fallopian tube rather than the uterus, right?
Yes. Right. And so, so as a part of that, I ended up losing the tube that the baby was in too.
Mm.
And so we didn't really know, like, I mean, you can still get pregnant, obviously, but we didn't really know, like, okay, is this going to make it harder? You know, I am getting older. So Chris and I mean, I still remember exactly where we were. We were talking about this, and we were looking at like adoption sites and things. And we saw that there were like overwhelming amounts of kids with disabilities who need to be adopted.
Wow.
And a lot of the kids had Down syndrome. And I'm like, wow, like, you know, that's like, we could totally do that. Like, we could totally adopt a baby with Down syndrome. That would be, you know, that would be really great. And we definitely talked about it. Well, then Chris told the genetic counselor that after she brought it up for like the third time, like, if you want to terminate the pregnancy. And he was like, well, actually, like, we had talked about adopting a baby with Down syndrome before this happened. And she was just like, I still remember the way she said it. And she was like, really? And I was like, maybe this isn't the job for you.
Right, yeah.
Should be doing this, but I mean, maybe it is a job for her, because it seemed like she kind of like had a bit of an agenda there, unfortunately.
Right. Well, that's kind of a question that I was going to ask you was, in your experience, do you think that there is a nefarious agenda?
Oh yeah, I mean, I do think so, and I say that as, I mean, you know,
yeah, I know.
You know, I am a pro-choice person. I am, but what I'm not is people making decisions based on fear or lack of information.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's a lot of what happens. And this is just like, you know, I've talked to so many different parents, you know, who've had a diagnosis. I really enjoy doing it. You know, I think it brings me a lot of joy. I really appreciate the people who talked to me when we had our diagnosis. And it's overwhelming, the amount of people that, I mean, I've even heard people say, like, it's just assumed that they're going to have a termination. Like, people have called, the doctor's office has called, like, when should we schedule this?
Wow.
So now my doctor, my actual OBGYN, was nothing like that. I mean, she was extremely supportive. This was just like the genetic counselor that we, you know, had the bad experience with. But my doctor, nothing like that. She was absolutely wonderful, very encouraging, you know, didn't ever even suggest anything like that. So, but unfortunately, I guess some people's OBs even kind of go down that road.
Wow.
So.
Which, you know, the whole thing, and we might get into a little bit of it, but as we continue on with your story, but there's just a lot of nuances like that deserve to be talked about, and
Sure.
and there's, you know, and both sides are guilty of wanting, both political sides now, right? If we look at the political aspect of that that issue, is that both sides are so strongly wanting to push whatever agenda they have, that there's all these things in between that get left out of the conversation. And, you know, where for me, I'm what probably you would describe as the pro-life side. Now, sometimes I don't even know that I want to be associated with the pro-life side, because of how sometimes there's the message is there's not always the pro-life message I'm not always with, other than I'm for life.
Sure.
So, yeah. But I understand that there are these nuances that we have to sort out, and we have to talk about those things. And the problem is we can't even get to a place of agreement. It's just, you know, so much about this side, and it's about, you know, you just want to control women's bodies. And then this is like on the really far side of this is like, you know, there are
no exceptions.
There's extreme versions of it, right? So I do get frustrated by that rhetoric, because there is this truth about it, and then stuff like this gets hidden, right? Because the left side, they don't want this kind of story to be told, and they don't want it to be told that there is nefarious, you know, agendas behind. You know, you throw out the word eugenics, right? I think that's the right word. And, you know, and it's like, oh, that's just, you know, alt-right conspiracy stuff. And it's like, wait a minute, no, this is real. Like, it
definitely happens. I mean, you know, I'm pretty much a fire-breathing liberal, and I can tell you it happens. I mean, it happened to me. And, you know, I will say, like, you know, and I know, and I understand what you mean when you say you don't want to be associated with like certain when it goes too far, right? Because like an interesting thing that happened to me,
like just to give you one example real quick, is just like, you know, well, they should keep their legs closed if they don't want to have a baby. Like, I'm not going to not have compassion towards women regardless of the decisions that they make. Like, so I'm not on board with that message.